Hello and welcome to my channel. Vice Rhino here. Today I'm looking at a video from Campaign for Christ International. You may remember this channel as being the one that had the video proving that Christianity is true, with really loud crickets in the background. Well, today he's inside, so no crickets, and he's proving that evolution is not true. Let's go!
Hello friends, Josiah Alway here with Campaign for Christ International, and today we're going to be talking about evolution versus creation. And I'm going to give you my top 4 reasons why I do not believe in evolution.
Taking bets now as to whether or not one of the reasons is that he doesn't understand thermodynamics.
Now you might be thinking, well, why is that even important? I mean, why do we even have to debate evolution and creation?
Well, the main reason we still have to debate that is because creationists still exist. A bunch of lay people think they've figured out a biological issue that somehow 99% of biologists missed. And usually it's based on some extremely basic high school level science, as though people who spend their entire lives studying science all somehow missed that one grade 11 biology class. It'd be kind of like telling an astrophysicist that you've debunked the current model of stellar formation because the pressure in a gas cloud that resulted from Boyle's law would be too much for gravity to overcome, therefore stellar formation is impossible. Just never mind that Boyle's law assumes a constant temperature in a closed system.
As that cloud rotates around and around, it will begin to collapse inward due to the gravity. But as it does so, it generates heat pressure, which is stronger than the gravity and always causes that cloud to expand outward. That, folks, is real science.
Oh, crap. Creationists have used that one. Okay, I guess high school science is all you need to debunk any well-established scientific field at this point in history.
And the reason it's important is because if evolution is true, then the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible, is discredited.
I mean, that's certainly not a universally agreed opinion among Christians, and really, statistically speaking, the Christians who deny evolution are in the minority. It just seems like creationists are the majority because they are just so darn loud about the topic. And a lot of times, the more moderate Christians who accept evolution just don't make a lot of noise about it. I suspect this is because, as a Christian, the most important thing in the world for you is an acceptance of Christ as Savior. Scientific accuracy is, at best, a secondary consideration. And so if you see that someone's faith relies on their denial of science, it might seem better to let them have their science denial if it means they stay saved, right? And this is one of the reasons I oppose religion in general. Even moderate religion lends credence to the more extreme versions of itself.
And ultimately, that discredits the entire Bible.
I mean, there were Christians going back to at least the 4th century who didn't think Genesis had to be taken literally. Augustine, for instance, argued for an instantaneous creation, with the 6 days of creation being an allegory. Well, his earlier writings argued for that. He did eventually come to a literalist interpretation, but the point here is that a literal interpretation is not the only possibility, even when looking at various interpretations of the Bible throughout history.
So it's a very, very important topic. So 4 reasons why I do not believe in evolution. Number 1, over decades and decades of research, scientists still haven't discovered a fossil that proves a transitional kind.
We have all sorts of transitional fossils. Really, though, this whole thing hinges on how we're defining a transitional fossil, because each individual species is wholly whatever species it is. There is no half this and half that species. What we look for with transitional fossils are species with features that are ambiguous. They could fit into multiple categories. Now, for the purposes of this video, I'm just going to ignore the fact that every organism that successfully reproduces is technically a transitional organism, and instead I'll focus on transitional fossils. So if we look at something like whale evolution, we actually have a pretty robust collection of transitions. But just to pick one feature, if a whale evolved from an ancestor like Indohyus, which was like a miniature hippo-deer hybrid thing, kind of like the modern-day water chevrotain, then how did the nostrils move from the snout to the top of the head? Would we not expect to find transitional forms where the nostrils are more in the middle? Well, That's exactly what we do find, like in this Irreducible skull. And when looking at the modern water chevrotain, we can actually see why such placement would be beneficial. It hides underwater from predators, but it can only hold its breath for about 4 minutes, so if the predator is patient enough, it'll be able to catch it when it comes up for air. But notice that when it sneaks up for air, it tries to keep most of itself still hidden underwater while just poking its nose up for a quick breath. Seems like having nostrils that are placed in a way that would allow it to keep more of itself underwater while breathing would be beneficial, would it not? Even just moving them up on the snout just a tiny little bit while rotating them to face a little bit more upward would be beneficial. And this is just one example of a transition that we have. We have a lot of examples of transitions like this from a lot of different categories of animals, including humans.
What I'm saying by that is they've never found a fossil where they've been able to prove that monkeys evolved into humans, or that some kind of an animal evolved into a completely different kind of animal.
No one fossil will accomplish that, which is something that creationists actually rely on in order to quote-unquote debunk transitional fossils. In order to work out a transition, you need a series of fossils. And even here, my use of the word series can potentially cause some confusion, because at the end of the day, we don't know for certain if one particular species from the fossil record was actually the ancestor of another species. So what we're really looking for with transitional species is not necessarily direct ancestry, just example organisms that show the likely development path of whatever trait we're looking at. So in my example of whale nostrils, it is entirely possible that neither Indohyus nor Adiocetus are actually the ancestors of modern whales. But what they do show us is that there was an evolutionary niche that was able to be filled with that particular trait, and the filling of the niche with that trait eventually did lead to modern whales.
And Charles Darwin actually said that he believed it was the fossil record that was going to prove evolution were true. Well,
creationists love to make claims about evolution that are based on what Darwin said, as though a scientist from the 1800s is somehow still today on the cutting edge of biology. Darwin lived in a time when, should he have fallen ill, there was a fairly decent chance that whatever doctor he went to would prescribe bloodletting as a treatment. Our understanding of biology has come a long way since then, so while it is entirely appropriate to celebrate Darwin as being a great scientific mind, we also have to contextualize it. It's impossible for him to have not been over a century out of date as compared to modern biology. On account of his being dead for more than a century. But also, Darwin's discussion of fossils is a pretty good example of how evolution can be verified by its predictions. At the time, Precambrian fossils were unknown and a bit of a mystery. So the Cambrian explosion looked, to scientists of the time, much as modern creationists present it, a sudden explosion of life with no precursors. Darwin was vexed by this, stating, "The case at present must remain inexplicable, and may be truly urged as a valid argument against the views here entertained." So, knowing that in Darwin's time Precambrian fossils were unknown, one might predict that one day such fossils would be found if evolution is true. And indeed, they were. But the fact that we have solved this particular mystery doesn't stop creationists from pointing to this quote as if it is some fatal flaw in all of evolutionary theory, even writing books that use this as their starting point, like Darwin's Doubt by Stephen Meyer.
After decades and decades of research, we've never found evidence through the fossil record of a transitional kind.
I mean, I gave you one just off the top of my head, but we also have plenty of transitions aside from this one. In fact, if you just take a few minutes to look into it, you'll find that there are plenty of living organisms that fit the bill pretty well for transitional organisms. Fish with lungs, fish that spend a good chunk of their life outside the water, snakes and squirrels that glide with wing-like structures, and really, even humans. We're in the process of losing our wisdom teeth. Recent mutations that allow for more efficient processing of omega fatty acids are spreading, and lactose tolerance is also spreading, just to name a few.
Reason number 2. I don't believe in the theory, or better said, the hypothesis of evolution, because of the second law of thermodynamics, which basically states that chaos cannot produce order.
There it is. Do I win a prize? No, the second law of thermodynamics does not state that chaos cannot produce order. Written on the screen, you have it a little bit closer. The total entropy of a system can never decrease, only increase over time. That's less wrong, but it's still wrong. Not only is it missing the important specification of what type of system this applies to, even then, can never decrease is not entirely true. So the second law of thermodynamics, stated more properly, is that the total entropy of an isolated system increases over time. And on top of that, this is not the only way to state it. It has many variations depending on the application it's being used for, and experiments have shown that over short periods and small scales, it is possible for a system to break the second law of thermodynamics. Now, obviously, that isn't really applicable to evolution, as evolution is a large-scale, long time period process, but it still makes the statement the entropy of a system can never decrease a false statement, even if we're talking about an isolated system. But really, the isolated system part is the important part here, because if entropy always increases and never decreases in any system, then it would be literally impossible for us to do anything, including living.
If evolution were true, then a chaotic explosion in the universe, namely the Big Bang...
The Big Bang was not a chaotic explosion in the universe. It was the beginning of the expansion of the universe. Continue.
ultimately evolved into an incredible amount of order. I mean, you just look at the DNA of the human body.
I mean, going from the Big Bang to human DNA is quite the jump there. You skipped an awful lot of steps. But yeah, it's actually been hypothesized that life is a byproduct of the tendency for the development of systems that increase entropy more efficiently, as in the development of life happens because of the second law of thermodynamics, not in spite of it. Also, while human DNA patterns are quite complex, when you look at all the parts that make up DNA, they are all fairly simple, and are known to occur naturally. I mean, obviously they're all over nature being contained in everything that has DNA. I mean non-life nature, like on meteorites and whatnot.
The amount of intricate detail in the DNA, or in the human eye, or whatever you want to look at in the world, it's incredibly complex.
And if we're looking for design, simplicity is the hallmark of good design. So the question is there a way that the same thing could have been accomplished but in a more simple way? Does every cell in the body need to contain and replicate the whole genome every time it reproduces? Was there not a way to have, say, eye cells only contain the genes needed for eye production? And how about things like the recurrent laryngeal nerve? It just needs to go from the base of the brain to the back of the throat, a relatively short journey, but it makes a loop down through the chest before coming back up. Yes, it innervates some things on its way down into the chest, but for that trip, it's part of a larger bundle of nerves. Would it not have been better to innervate those areas with the other nerves that had to go past them anyway, and make the shorter nerve go straight from the brain to the throat? And the crux here is, if someone who is as bad at cable management as I am can tell you how to do it better, what does that say about the quality of the design?
And what evolution is saying is that chaos in the universe ultimately produced order, which is completely against the second law of thermodynamics.
Nope. If we look at the universe as a whole, even though there are local patches where the total entropy appears to have decreased, the overall entropy has increased significantly since the Big Bang, mostly because of black holes. So as long as the overall entropy of the universe is increasing, no laws of thermodynamics are being broken. And black holes are basically entropy-producing machines. If we remove black holes from the equation, the entropy of the universe has remained relatively constant since the Big Bang. But black holes create massive amounts of entropy. So thermodynamics is quite safe here. Oh, and did I mention that we don't even know if the universe is an isolated system at this point? So it's even hypothetically possible for the entropy to decrease in the universe as a whole without breaking any laws of thermodynamics. But that takes us into speculation territory, so it's just easier to assume that the universe is an isolated system because that's how it appears to behave.
Reason number 3. If evolution is true, what came first?
If you wish to make an apple pie from scratch, you must first invent the universe.
The blood, the heart, or the blood vessel? Neither of which can survive without the other.
Well, that depends on what you consider to be blood, because the main purpose of the circulatory system, at its core, is to reduce the functional diffusion distance that nutrients, gases, and metabolic waste products must traverse. as in a single cell gets its nutrients and expels its waste through the process of diffusion, and because the surface area of a cell increases in proportion to the radius of the cell squared, while the volume increases in proportion to the radius cubed, there's only so big a cell can get and still get all its nutrients through diffusion, even when utilizing things like wrinkles to increase the surface area. So if we consider any fluid that facilitates diffusion by carrying nutrients to the cell and waste away from the cell, then strictly speaking, by this definition, whatever fluid a cell exists in is its blood. But that's too much of a loosey-goosey definition. It does give us a hint at what the answer will be, though. It's blood. Blood came first. And from here on out, we're more concerned about oxygen transportation than nutrients because, well, our cells do still get their nutrients from the blood gets the nutrients from the digestive system, and if I go down every side path explaining where it came from, then you might as well take an evolutionary biology class rather than watch my videos, because it's all interconnected. So if there's a selection pressure to increase in size, like, say, the existence of a filter feeder that cannot physically eat its prey when it's too big, then at some point a single-celled organism will have to develop the trait of multicellularity, which is a development that is surprisingly easy given what we've seen in single-celled algae populations which were examined in this exact scenario. Now, obtaining oxygen by diffusion has a limited distance over which it can be effective, typically less than 1 millimeter, which means that we have to either somehow get this fluid into the core of the organism in order to allow diffusion to feed the cells, or arrange the body in such a way as to not have any cell that's too far away from its environment to use diffusion. Because evolution is weird, we see both. Obviously, we have our circulatory systems, but there are organisms whose body geometries allow them to oxygenate all of the cells in their body through diffusion, like certain flatworms. Now, when an organism oxygenates all of its cells through diffusion but don't have any system of internal fluid support, they're called acoelommates. There are also organisms that have a body cavity that forms within the mesoderm that carries coelomic fluid, protoblood, if you will. These guys are dubbed eucoelommates. They have no pumping system, instead using a network of cellular cilia to move the coelomic fluid. But some eucoelommates exist whose body cavity has become subdivided into interconnected chambers connected by channels, or blood vessels, if you will. Blood transport in eucoelommates is accomplished in a variety of manners, everything from the blood vessels themselves contracting to having a specialized pump organ, hearts, if you will. You may have guessed by now that you yourself are included in the group of organisms known as eucoelommates, complete with your specialized organ known as the heart. So thus far I have just listed types of organisms with varying types of circulatory systems that exist today, but from what we can see today, it's not hard to think of a plausible evolutionary path leading from no circulatory system at all the way up to the various complicated circulatory systems that we see today. Also, not really a relevant point, but I like that your diagram of the heart was labeled in Georgian for some reason. And that's Georgian as in the Georgia that Genesis Apologetics thinks is in Russia, not Florida's neighbor, Georgia.
They reported they found skulls in Georgia, like Russia.
It makes me think that you just picked the most sciencey looking image without really looking at it too closely.
One of our team members in Campaign for Christ International is a medical doctor, Dr. Fidel Reyes. You've probably seen him make videos on this channel before. And he and I were talking about this. As a doctor, if he looks at the human body, he'll see that there are many parts of the human body that rely on other parts of the body.
This is true. Now, what makes you think that such reliance could never evolve? We've already seen how it could happen with the cardiovascular system. It goes from getting oxygen directly from the environment to having a space in a pile of cells that allows oxygen transfer, to sealing off this space and moving the fluid with cilia, which already existed for other purposes, to further sealing off this fluid and moving it by contracting the vessels that contain it, to some of the contractee vessels getting better at contracting than the other ones. And boom, full-blown cardiovascular system with no insurmountable steps at any point in the process. Of course, I did drastically oversimplify it, but like I said, this is not a biology class. My main point is that this information is out there, and it's actually really easy to find should you want to learn how things like this evolved. In this case, my main source is literally called Evolutionary Origins of the Blood Vascular System and Endothelium. That might be a good starting point for learning how the blood vascular system evolved.
And the example in this particular case that I'm using is blood, the heart, and the blood vessel. If evolution were true, how did all three of those evolve at the same time?
If you really want to know the answer to that question, then why are you asking YouTube and not an evolutionary biologist? Or even just Google, how did the cardiovascular system evolve? The first two results that weren't ads or Google's attempt to answer the question directly without actually clicking on links were the paper that I've been using as my main source and an article from BioLogos, an organization that is very much a Christian organization that works to harmonize science with the Bible. I sometimes wonder when people make videos like this what the ratio is between just plain ignorance because they haven't been exposed to the information they're asking about, and willful ignorance where they refuse to learn. Do people not think to run even the most basic of fact-checking before making a video? Like, if you have questions that you think will completely debunk a major part of modern science, at least do the bare minimum and type your question into Google before assuming that it cannot and never has been answered. Like, yeah, Google can get you to a lot of bad information, but even considering that, how many creationist arguments can be completely debunked with just a simple Google search? The answer is a lot. There's a lot of them. Maybe even most of them.
You see, all of the parts of the human body would have had to come together in one moment for the body to exist.
Well, let's take a new angle. You know that pregnancy is a thing, right? Well, the brain won't work without a body, and a body won't work without the brain, right? So, which came first? The body, because the body of a developing embryo can work without a brain up to a point. It's not quite the same thing, but it's close enough to make a half-decent analogy. In this case, the body came before the brain, and in our evolutionary history, this is also true. Brainless organisms were the first ones to evolve, and in fact, plenty of them still exist today. And no, I'm not going to make a joke about creationists being in that category. That would be tasteless. Shame on you for even thinking of that.
Evolution just doesn't provide the answer to the complexities of the human body.
It absolutely does. You just have to stop thinking of it in terms of discrete organs coming into existence in a vacuum. Everything about our bodies evolved in tandem with everything else about our bodies. So no, our cardiovascular system would not work if it existed in its current form with no heart, or with no blood, or whatever. But nobody thinks that that's how it developed except for creationists. Same goes for any other organ or system in our bodies, including the nervous system.
And reason number 4, and I say this one because I'm a Christian, I believe in the story of creation, not evolution, because of the first verse of the first book of the Bible.
The first verse of the first book of the Bible is not in opposition to evolution. Most of what comes after it is, if you insist on interpreting it literally, but the first verse just says that God created shit. Doesn't say how he did it, just that he did it.
In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth.
Right. We haven't even gotten to biology yet with this verse, so you can believe that all you want, and it doesn't say anything about biology. And I know you probably consider the Big Bang to be a part of the theory of evolution because a lot of creationists like to lump those things together, but this doesn't even say anything that goes against Big Bang cosmology. Again, there is plenty of that later, but you're listing this specific verse as why you don't believe in science, and it's not even one that denies anything scientific. Plenty of scientists are happy believing that God created everything and then looking at science as their investigation into the methods that God used, and this specific verse is very much in line with that endeavor.
In future videos, I'll tell you why I think it makes sense to believe in the Bible and why you can trust the Bible.
I'll have to take a peek at some of those future videos, because given how generally untrustworthy the Bible is, I'm definitely not just going to take it at face value for scientific stuff.
But clearly, if you believe in the scripture as inspired by God, you can't believe in evolution.
Everyone who works at BioLogos disagrees with you. Even evolution-denying creationists like Frank Turek disagree with you.
Let's say, for the sake of argument, that macroevolution is true, that the Darwinists are right. Does that mean God does not exist or Jesus didn't rise from the dead? No. So even if they're right, it doesn't affect whether or not Christianity is true.
And since statistically speaking, most Christians don't have a problem with evolution, this pretty much definitionally means that a belief in the Bible does not preclude a belief in evolution.
We know from genealogies and many different reasons in the Bible that Adam and Eve were created about 6,000 years ago.
You know this from estimates about genealogies that are very obviously inaccurate. In Mesopotamian culture, exaggerated ages of important figures were pretty normal. Just look up the Sumerian kings list sometime. They have individual kings ruling from anywhere from 300 to 1500 years. There are a few potential reasons for this, but one of the most likely is the ancient Hebrew penchant for numerology. They liked to assign meanings to numbers and had whole systems of assigning numbers to letters, words, and names. In this case, all of the ages given in Genesis can be expressed as various combinations of 60 and 7, both culturally significant numbers. Admittedly, numerology is one of those things where you can find a pattern in pretty much any dataset if you look hard enough, but we know that the ancient Hebrews did use numerology, so that is a potentially valid explanation. My point is, it's not necessarily the case that these genealogies were ever even intended to be taken literally, and so creationists insisting that they are literal are potentially missing out on the deeper meaning that was intended by the author.
So a lot of Christians nowadays are saying, well, maybe before Adam and Eve were created, maybe evolution did exist. They say, well, maybe the 6 days of creation, as is recorded in the first chapter of the book of Genesis, maybe that's figurative.
Maybe. Or maybe an ancient civilization stories about the beginning of the universe were simply their best attempt at an explanation, and so reflect their culture rather than 21st century scientific data. That's how we treat every other creation myth. Why would it be any different for this one?
Maybe they say evolution was true, and then about 6,000 years ago, Adam and Eve existed. But that can't be the case if you really believed that the Bible was inspired, because in the first chapter of the book of Genesis, when referring to the 6 days of creation, the Bible uses the term, or the word in the Hebrew, yom, Y-O-M. This word yom, whenever it's accompanied with the phrase the evening and the morning, or whenever it's accompanied by a number like the 6th day or the 5th day, in the Hebrew, it's always referring to a 24-hour day.
Now, do you know that because you've studied biblical Hebrew, or do you know that because you heard Ken Ham say it? Because that's a rule that was basically made up by creationists. Not only is that not a general rule for ancient Hebrew, but even in the Bible it doesn't hold true. Isaiah 9 and Hosea 6 both use the word yom to mean a non-literal day, well accompanied by a number. And as far as the evening and morning are concerned, we know that evenings and mornings in Genesis can't be literal, because in order to have an evening and morning literally, you would have to have a sun, and the sun wasn't created until day 4. So if the evenings and mornings are not literal evenings and mornings, why would we have to consider the days taking place in between these evenings and mornings to be literal days? The answer is, we don't.
Which means that if you take the Bible literally, as it was in the original Hebrew, the 6 days of creation referred to in the book of Genesis are referring to 6 24-hour days.
Yeah, but also if we take the Bible literally, then talking snakes and donkeys are a thing that happens, as are stars that are capable of falling to the earth. So maybe don't take it literally?
So there you have it. My 4 top reasons why I do not believe evolution is true, and I think the biblical account of creation is true.
And all 4 of those reasons are based on false assumptions. Didn't Jesus say something about having a foundation of sand versus a foundation of sturdy rock?
Anyway, I'd love to hear from you.
Well, I'm glad that you'd love to hear from me, because here I am.
You can comment below. Tell me why I'm wrong. Tell me why maybe you agree with me. I'd love to start a conversation with you.
Actually, you seem like the kind of guy that I wouldn't mind having on my channel to have a discussion with. At the very least, you seem honest and sincere, where many other apologists, well, let's just say they don't come across as honest and sincere. So that's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Brian Brown, who says, as the founder and only member of the American Society of Secular Humanists and Therapists, asshat, we have firmly concluded that a God belief gives whiter teeth and fresher breath. And I really just chose this one to show off that amazing acronym that I really hope somebody uses to create a real organization sometime, because I would love to be able to say that asshat gives the best therapist recommendations. Thanks for watching. Special thanks as always to my patrons, Jeffrey Dahmer, Mark McManus, Mark Hetcham, Clench Eastwood, Lynn Dobbs, and all the rest, who are the contractee blood vessels that evolved into the heart of my channel. If you'd like to keep me alive, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino. If you feel so inclined, you can also support the channel through direct donation or my Amazon wishlist. Links to social media, all the ways to support the channel, and to my other projects like my podcast with my daughter can be found at links.vicerhino.com. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time!